Welcome to this explainer. Today, we are unpacking a really massive, highly debated controversy, a century-old dispute between Turkey and Armenia. Now, to do this objectively, we're looking exclusively at the official archives, the historical translations, and the legal frameworks provided directly by the Turkish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We're not here to take sides. We're just exploring exactly what these specific documents say and how they construct the official Turkish perspective on the events of 1915. Let's get right into it.
It's a huge question, right? How exactly do nations resolve these deeply entrenched historical disputes, especially when the narratives are just completely opposed? Well, today we're going to look at the historical, legal, and diplomatic frameworks laid out in these specific sources to understand exactly how the Turkish government approaches that very question. Here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at the 1915 controversy itself. Second, the Kachesnuni report. Third, the legal definitions of genocide. And finally, the ongoing proposal for a joint commission.
All right, Section 1, the 1915 controversy, a dispute over history.
So, the Turkish Ministry of Foreign Affairs documents explicitly present this whole issue as a, quote, controversy between Turkey and Armenia about the events of 1915. Rather than adopting the terminology often used by Armenian lobbies, the official archives frame this as a highly complex historical dispute, one that they argue requires rigorous, objective academic investigation. And to back this stance up, the ministry actually provides a massive, incredibly detailed library of publications, international court decisions, and historical reports. All of this is aimed at contextualizing the events surrounding World War I and the absolute collapse of the Ottoman Empire.
Moving right along to Section 2, the Kachesnuni report, a 1923 historical confession.
The sources highlight a very specific sequence of events here. It starts with the formation of Armenian volunteer units back in 1914, leads right into the compulsory relocations of 1915, and culminates in 1923. Now, 1923 is absolutely key. That was the year Armenia's very first prime minister, Ovan Kachesnuni, presented some highly controversial and deeply reflective findings to the Tajnak party at a meeting in Bucharest.
According to the provided translation of his 128-page report, the former prime minister was actually remarkably blunt about the actions taken during the war. Kachesnuni explicitly stated that Armenian forces actively participated in military operations and rebelled. He notes that their actions were driven by this desire to secure a sea-to-sea Armenia, which was a massive territorial expansion promised to them by the Allied powers in exchange for their cooperation against the Ottoman Empire. When reflecting on the compulsory relocations of 1915, the translation of Kachesnuni's report describes the Turkish response as a definitive method from their perspective. The text notes his view that, when you look at it within the context of the ongoing war and the rebellions, the Ottoman response was considered a measure of self-defense against internal uprisings during a broader global conflict. It's a pretty striking admission from an internal document.
He actually concludes his retrospective by acknowledging that rejecting Turkish peace offers was a massive, massive error. He states that even after 1918, when the Turks offered to negotiate, the Armenian leadership flat-out refused. According to this translated text, Kachesnuni attributed these catastrophic miscalculations to what he called a sick national psychology. He believed the Armenian leadership was continually deceived by foreign powers, the British, French, and Russians, who basically used them to advance their own wartime agendas.
Okay, on to Section 3, Legal Definitions of Genocide, UN and International Law.
The Turkish archives heavily emphasize that the term genocide isn't just some descriptive word you can casually throw around. It is a very specific legal definition with incredibly strict criteria. The sources argue that applying this label requires meeting precise legal thresholds established by international law. They even cite statements from leaders like French President Emmanuel Macron, highlighting the absolute necessity of these legal qualifications before any historical event can officially be categorized in this manner.
To really bolster this legal perspective, the documents highlight statements spanning over a decade from some of the highest-ranking officials at the United Nations. We're talking Secretary General Antonio Guterres, along with multiple spokespeople and high representatives. By curating all these statements, the archives aim to demonstrate that the UN maintains a very strict position on these necessary legal qualifications. So the crucial takeaway here is that, according to these sources, the terminology cannot just be applied through some political consensus. It mandates a rigorous legal standard, a standard that the Turkish sources argue has simply not been met regarding the events of 1915.
Which brings us to Section 4, Proposing a Joint Commission, Ongoing Diplomatic Efforts.
The official documents outline a highly consistent diplomatic effort. Since 2005, when a formal letter was first sent to the president of Armenia, Turkey has repeatedly proposed establishing a joint historical commission. The whole idea here is to have scholars objectively investigate the archives of both nations as well as any third-party archives. And this effort is totally ongoing. There's been a continuous stream of annual letters from President Erdogan to the Armenian Patriarch of Turkey right up to the most recent documented letter in 2025.
So the overarching theme of these sources really contrasts the current status, which is obviously defined by these deeply entrenched conflicting narratives, with a very specific proposed solution. The core of the Turkish diplomatic strategy revealed in these archives is to step back. Step back from the political declarations being made by third-party parliaments and instead focus on a shared scholarly investigation. The goal is to reconcile these conflicting accounts by just letting the primary source documents speak entirely for themselves.
As we wrap up this explainer and look back at the documents we've reviewed today, the 1923 historical reports, the strict legal definitions upheld by the UN, and these recurring diplomatic proposals for a joint scholarly commission, we really have to ask ourselves, how will this intersection of historical archives, international law, and ongoing diplomacy ultimately influence the resolution of this enduring dispute? It's a profound question that continues to shape modern geopolitics, and it's one that absolutely requires us to look incredibly closely at the primary sources. Thanks so much for joining me as we explored this complex topic today. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll see you in the next explainer.